Hello there and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, if you happen to enjoy these quiet meanderings through time, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps more than you might think. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Germany, as it stands today, is a relatively young nation in the grand stretch of history, yet the lands that make up its modern form have witnessed millennia of gentle tides and violent eddies, of tribes moving quietly through forested glades, of emperors and monks, merchants and peasants, all shaping and being shaped by the rhythms of time. This is not the tale of triumphs and turning points as often told, but rather a soft-spoken stroll through the winding corridors of an old and layered past. The story begins long before there was anything called Germany at all. In the misty woods and meadows of Central Europe, early peoples hunted, gathered, and slowly settled, crafting tools and customs that would echo dimly down through the centuries. The Romans, ever curious and ever cautious, would name these folk Germani, though the name may have meant little to the tribes themselves. Across the Rhine, Rome held its borders, always watchful of the unpredictable wild beyond. Yet even in those early days, a slow exchange occurred of goods, of ideas, and occasionally of blood. Later, as the Roman world began to flicker and fade, a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities began to take form in its place. The Franks among them would come to dominate much of the western part of the region, and a man named Charlemagne would be crowned in the year 800, not as a king alone, but as emperor of a realm with both sacred and temporal weight. His rule marked the beginning of something new, an attempt to stitch together the spiritual legacy of Rome with the earthy realities of medieval life. But the world he left behind was fragile. His empire divided, frayed, and gave rise to a looser association of territories that would come to be known in time as the Holy Roman Empire. This vast and complex entity was neither holy, nor Roman, nor quite an empire, as some have said, but it endured for centuries, a slow, ponderous giant that presided over village councils and princely courts alike. In this long span, we find a quieter sort of history, the slow spread of monasteries, the soft hush of parchment being copied by candlelight, the click of wooden shoes on cobbled streets. There were wars, to be sure, and plenty of noise, but tonight we will turn our gaze to the more subdued corners, to the rhythms of farming calendars, the hush of forest paths, the smoky hearths where stories were told in dialects long since faded. Through Reformation and revolt, through kings and philosophers, soldiers and school teachers, the people of these lands carried on, living, working, and slowly reshaping what it meant to be German. And in that slow reshaping lies the heart of our journey. So now, as your eyes begin to soften and the day gently loosens its grip, let us begin where so many stories do. At the edge of an old empire, in the company of ancient tribes and whispering trees. In the hush of pre-Roman Europe, long before city walls and cathedrals would come to punctuate the land, the region that would one day be called Germany was a quiet mosaic of dense forests, rolling rivers, and shifting tribal territories. The climate was cooler, the nights long in winter, and the land itself thick with oaks, pines, and mist that drifted like breath across the valleys. Here, small communities lived in wooden huts with thatched roofs, surrounded by fields they tilled with wooden ploughs and grazed by shaggy cattle and pigs that rooted in the underbrush. The people of these lands, the Cherushi, Swabi, Chatti, and many others, were not unified by any overarching authority. Each tribe, large or small, was its own world, led by chieftains whose authority rested more on reputation than decree. Councils of elders held sway in many matters, and warriors were held in high esteem. Though their battles were often local, their causes deeply rooted in land, honour, or custom. Their language was Germanic, though fragmented into dialects, and their stories passed orally from one hearthside to the next. Life was deeply seasonal. Spring brought hope, planting, and new lambs. Summer was a time of toil and open markets. Autumn, a moment to gather and prepare. And winter, a season of introspection, story, and rest. Tools were simple but skillfully made. Women wove textiles from wool, dyed in earthy tones. Men hunted, fished, and carved wooden implements. Children played, learned by watching, and slowly stepped into the roles of their kin. To the south and west, however, something different stirred. The Roman Empire, with its roads and aqueducts, its military discipline and marble columns, was edging ever closer to the borders of these tribal lands. Julius Caesar had noted the Germani in his commentaries, describing them with both fascination and apprehension. They were, he wrote, tall and fierce, with a culture distinct from the Gauls. Yet even Caesar recognized that these people were not a single entity, but many interwoven strands, often at odds with each other. By the 1st century AD, the Roman frontier had reached the Rhine and Danube rivers, natural boundaries that offered both protection and passage. The Romans built forts and established provinces in the regions they could hold, notably in what is now Western Germany, places like Cologne, Colonia Claudiaria Agrippinensium, Mainz, Mogontiacum, and Trier, Augusta Treverorum. These settlements grew steadily, with stone buildings, baths, and amphitheatres, a world apart from the wooden halls of the northern tribes. Trade followed the legions. Roman pottery, coins, and wine made their way into Germanic hands, exchanged for amber, furs, and slaves. Some tribes became clients or allies of Rome, accepting gifts, titles, or limited autonomy in return for peace. Others resisted more fiercely, preferring the uncertain independence of the forests to the disciplined order of Roman rule. One such moment of resistance came to define the relationship between the empire and the tribes for centuries. In the year 9 AD, in the dark woods of the Teutoburg forest, a coalition of Germanic tribes led by Arminius, a man raised partly within Roman ranks, ambushed and destroyed 3 Roman legions. The defeat was devastating, and Rome would never again attempt to fully conquer the lands beyond the Rhine. The line was drawn, not in treaties, but in blood and silence. For the tribes, however, there was no empire in their stead, no unifying government or shared identity. What followed was not a rising of a Germanic nation, but a return to the usual rhythms, feuds, migrations, and quiet cycles of life. Over the next few centuries, pressures from beyond the region, the movement of Huns, Goths, and other peoples, would cause further shifts. Some Germanic groups migrated west and south, forming kingdoms in former Roman lands. The Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths and Lombards in Italy, the Vandals in North Africa, and the Franks in Gaul. The region of modern-day Germany, meanwhile, remained a patchwork of tribes and territories, less touched by Roman urbanity, but nonetheless influenced by it in subtle ways. Roman roads still traced through the forests, their stones worn smooth by centuries of hooves and boots. Latin phrases filtered into the vernacular. Religious ideas, especially Christianity, which began to spread quietly through trade and diplomacy, gained occasional footholds. Still, the vast majority of people lived in small rural communities, tethered to the soil and to each other. Their world was slow, often harsh, but familiar. Elders would speak of spirits in the woods, of omens in the sky, and of ancestors who watched from beyond. Time moved not by calendar, but by the changing of seasons, the ripening of fruit, and the stories passed each winter. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century marked the end of an age. Yet for the Germanic tribes, it was less a collapse and more a deepening of the patterns they already knew. Into this vacuum, the Franks would eventually rise, bringing with them a new form of kingship, one tied not to Rome, but to the land, to baptism, and to the slow emergence of what would one day be called Europe. But that, dear listener, is for another chapter. For now, let us rest here, in the flickering light of a tribal hearth, somewhere beyond the frontier, as the winds of change stir gently through the trees outside. As the shadow of Rome faded into memory, the lands of Western Europe, including much of what would become modern Germany, entered a quieter, more uncertain age. There were no longer legions marching through forested frontiers, nor governors administering laws written in Latin from marble halls. Instead, the rhythm of life returned to the deeply local, woven from the customs of tribes, the authority of chieftains, and the age-old patterns of agriculture and belief. Among the many Germanic peoples who had once lived on the margins of the Roman world, one group began to rise slowly but steadily, the Franks. Their early homeland lay along the lower Rhine, in a region straddling modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and Western Germany. Unlike some of their neighbours, the Franks did not migrate far after Rome's decline. Rather, they expanded gently, gradually filling the spaces where Roman control had once held sway. By the late 5th century, the Frankish world had begun to coalesce under the leadership of a single family, the Merovingians. The most famous of these early kings was Clovis, a warrior of considerable ambition and acumen. His name, rendered in Latin as Clodovecus, would eventually evolve into Louis, a name borne by many French monarchs thereafter. Yet Clovis was not French nor German in the modern sense. He was a Frank, and his realm was a fluid one, grounded as much in personal loyalty as in land. Clovis united the various Frankish tribes not only through military strength, but through an act of spiritual significance. Around the year 496, following a victory in battle and the urging of his Burgundian wife Clotilde, Clovis was baptized as a Christian, specifically into the Roman Catholic tradition, rather than the Arian Christianity favoured by many other Germanic rulers of the time. This decision would shape the religious direction of the region for centuries to come. His baptism was not just a private matter, it signalled to the former Roman populace, now scattered and subdued, that the Franks were willing inheritors of the Roman Christian legacy. It also aligned the Merovingians with the bishoprics of Gaul, which had survived the imperial collapse and still held sway over communities both rural and urban. In this way, the Franks gained not only a kingdom, but a sense of legitimacy, rare and valuable in a fractured world. Yet daily life under the early Franks remained simple. The Merovingian kings were often itinerant, moving from estate to estate, ruling from wooden halls rather than stone palaces. Their courts were lively with retainers, warriors, and petitioners, but lacked the bureaucracy and grandeur of Roman times. Fields were ploughed with oxen, and justice was dispensed according to custom. Compensations of silver, oaths sworn before elders, and occasional trials by ordeal. In what is now Western Germany, especially along the Rhine and into the Moselle Valley, the Frankish influence grew steadily. Roman towns, now smaller and somewhat decayed, were repurposed. Churches were built where temples once stood, and Latin monks began to transcribe not imperial law, but scripture and saints' lives. Slowly, a new synthesis emerged, Christian, rural, and deeply shaped by Frankish and Roman traditions alike. By the 7th century, the Merovingians had become increasingly ceremonial figures, their actual power waning in favour of local rulers and noble families. Among the most powerful of these were the mayors of the palace, court officials who in practice governed much of the kingdom. The most notable among them was Charles Martel, whose victory at the Battle of Tours in 732 became a later symbol of Christendom's resilience, though the battle itself was likely more modest than memory suggests. Charles's son, Pepin the Short, eventually deposed the last Merovingian king with the blessing of the Pope and founded a new dynasty, the Carolingians. This moment marked a subtle but important shift in the idea of kingship, now tied not only to blood and custom, but to divine sanction, given voice through the Church. It was a gentle return to something Rome once promised, the harmony of sword and scripture, of empire and faith. Under Pepin, and more famously his son Charlemagne, the Frankish kingdom would expand dramatically. Yet even as the empire grew, the rhythms of rural life changed little. In the villages and hamlets of eastern Prussia, the lands corresponding largely to modern Germany, people still lived much as they had for generations. They planted rye and barley, kept bees for honey, and gathered in wooden churches for mass. Bells rang out over misty fields, and the calendar turned with saints' days, sowing, and harvest. In time, the distinction between the Latinized world of the West and the older tribal lands of the East would become more pronounced. The Elbe River marked a kind of threshold beyond which Frankish influence was sparse. To the east lay Slavic peoples and the remnants of tribes never fully absorbed. The Franks, while ambitious, often stopped at these frontiers, preferring diplomacy, missionary work, and the slow pressure of trade to outright conquest. But within the settled lands, especially around Mainz, Cologne, and Worms, a quiet transformation took place. Monasteries dotted the landscape, places of peace and labour, where monks tilled the land, copied texts, and prayed through the hours of the day and night. These centres of learning and devotion became the cultural anchors of the region, preserving not only religious thought, but fragments of classical knowledge. And so, the rise of the Franks was not merely a political ascent, it was a gradual blending of cultures, of languages, of beliefs. In their world, a chieftain might become a king, a field hand might learn the Lord's Prayer, and a warrior's son might take vows and spend his life in quiet contemplation among the cloisters. This age did not sweep away the past, but gently covered it, layer by layer, like earth over old stones, until the old ways became whispers beneath the new. The Roman roads, now grassed over, still traced the contours of the land. The Germanic runes, once carved in wood and bone, gave way to Latin script, and in the hearts of the people, the world shifted, almost imperceptibly, from tribe to kingdom, from forest to churchyard, from the many to something slowly becoming one. And in this stillness, as the Carolingian dawn rose just over the horizon, the foundation was laid for a world both ancient and ever-renewing. As the 8th century drew to a close, the lands of the Franks, now stretching from the Pyrenees in the west to the Elbe in the east, from the North Sea down to the Italian peninsula, fell under the quiet yet commanding shadow of one man, Charles, son of Pepin the Short, remembered by posterity as Charlemagne. His name, in Latin, was Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, and in time his legacy would become one of the cornerstone myths of European history. Yet, as with all such tales, its truest essence lies not only in the deeds and titles, but in the slow and steady reshaping of the world beneath him. Charlemagne became king in 768, sharing the realm initially with his brother Carloman, whose early death left Charles sole ruler. Over the course of the next 4 decades, his reign would see not only military expansion, but also the forging of a new kind of kingship, one rooted in both Christian duty and the old Germanic traditions of rule. He was a warrior, to be sure, and many of his campaigns brought violence to distant frontiers. But he was also, and perhaps more lastingly, a builder of institutions, a patron of letters, and a figure whose reign brought a certain cohesion to the fragmented lands of Western Europe. Among his most enduring endeavours was the long Saxon campaign. The Saxons, whose homeland stretched across northern and central Germany, resisted Frankish authority with quiet tenacity. Their society was deeply tribal, their gods drawn from the old Germanic pantheon, and their allegiance to any external power tenuous at best. For over 30 years, Charlemagne led a series of campaigns into their territory, not always as invader, but often as missionary king, bearing both sword and cross. The wars were bitter and at times brutal, yet they also brought the Saxons into the orbit of a growing Christian polity. Though Charlemagne's methods may seem harsh by modern standards, his goal was less domination than unification. He believed, or at least professed to believe, that through baptism and education, even the most distant peoples could be brought into the fold of Christendom. He supported the building of churches, monasteries, and schools throughout the newly conquered regions. The Franks, while still warriors at heart, had come to see themselves as protectors of the Church, a role that would, in time, shape much of European identity. The year 800 marked a quiet but profound turning point. On Christmas Day, in the old Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. It was a symbolic act, rich with echoes of a past no longer quite real. Rome, in its ancient form, was long gone, yet the idea of empire, of unity under a Christian ruler, persisted, and now, with Charlemagne, that idea found new life. Though his empire was not Roman in structure or style, it carried forward the hope of continuity, of order amidst the shifting sands. Back in the eastern parts of his realm, across the Rhine and into what we might now consider Germany, life continued with its usual rhythms. The majority of people were not nobles or monks, but peasants, bound to the land, governed by the seasons. They lived in small villages, where wooden houses, huddled against the cold and communal work, sustained the whole. The manor was the basic unit of organisation, a patchwork of fields, pastures, and woodland, overseen by a local lord and worked by tenants who paid dues in kind or labour. The church, too, took deeper root in this period. Monastic foundations, many following the rule of Saint Benedict, became fixtures of the countryside. In places like Fulda, Reichenau, and Corvey, monks copied manuscripts, cultivated herb gardens, and offered prayers at regular intervals, day and night. Their scriptoria preserved not only religious texts, but fragments of classical learning, Virgil, Cicero, and Aristotle, though read through the lens of Christian doctrine. Charlemagne understood the power of knowledge, and under his guidance, a modest revival of learning took place, what historians have since called the Carolingian Renaissance. It was not a renaissance in the sense of grandeur or innovation, but rather a careful preservation. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric were taught anew. Latin was standardized. Books were copied in a clear, readable hand known as Carolingian minuscule. It was an age of quiet scholarship, of learning as devotion. His court at Aachen, then called Aix-la-Chapelle, became a kind of symbolic centre of the empire. There, a grand palace chapel was constructed, its octagonal dome inspired by Roman models, its columns brought from Ravenna. Charlemagne himself was said to be tall, fair-haired, and energetic well into old age. He spoke a rustic Latin, never mastering the art of writing, though he kept tablets beneath his pillow to practice by candlelight. He loved hunting, swimming, and listening to the readings of Augustine's City of God. In his later years, Charlemagne began to formalize the governance of his empire. He issued capitularies, written instructions on legal and administrative matters, and appointed missi dominici, royal envoys, who travelled the realm to ensure justice and fidelity. Yet he ruled less through bureaucracy and more through personal presence, travelling constantly, holding court in various locations, and maintaining ties of loyalty with noble families. When he died in 814, he was buried in the chapel at Aachen. His tomb, though later disturbed and embellished, remains a place of quiet reverence. His empire, however, would not long survive intact. His son, Louis the Pious, inherited a realm too vast and too fragile. Upon Louis's death, the empire was divided among his sons, leading to a series of partitions that gradually fractured the unity Charlemagne had so carefully nurtured. One such division, the Treaty of Verdun in 843, would mark the beginning of a new shape to the continent. The eastern portion of the empire, known as East Francia, would become the seedbed of what we now recognize as Germany. It was a land still deeply regional, still shaped by dialects, loyalties, and local laws. Yet it carried within it the memory of empire, the idea that unity, however fleeting, was possible. Charlemagne's legacy, then, was not simply in the lands he ruled, but in the quiet threads he wove, of faith, of learning, of lawful kingship. He did not create Germany, nor did he rule as a German. But in the eastern half of his empire his influence endured. The monks he supported, the laws he issued, the towns he fortified, all would serve as the roots from which a new, slow-growing identity might emerge. And so we leave him here, resting in the still air of Aachen, as the bells toll softly above and the cloisters echo with the rustle of parchment. The world he left behind is one of beginnings, not loud or sudden, but deep and lasting, like the roots of an old oak tree in the quiet soil. As the centuries turned, the eastern reaches of Charlemagne's old realm, known as East Francia, began to take on a shape and rhythm all of their own. Though fragmented and regionally diverse, these lands held within them the quiet embers of continuity, faint but enduring. From this mosaic of duchies, bishoprics, and free towns would arise a new political order, one that sought not to imitate Rome, but to echo its idea, the notion of a sacred realm guided by Christian virtue and imperial dignity. Thus began the slow and solemn unfolding of what would come to be known as the Holy Roman Empire. The beginnings were modest. After the Carolingian line in East Francia faltered in the early 10th century, a new dynasty emerged from the Duchy of Saxony. In 919, Henry the Fowler was elected king, not by divine right, but by the consensus of the realm's leading nobles. It was a telling moment. Kingship in this part of the world was not yet hereditary in the modern sense, but rested on recognition and respect, negotiated anew with each succession. Henry, a practical man fond of falconry, spent much of his reign strengthening the kingdom's defences and securing its borders. His rule was steady rather than spectacular. but it laid the groundwork for what was to follow. His son, Otto I, later known as Otto the Great, would take this foundation and build upon it with quiet determination. Crowned king in 936, Otto set about consolidating authority within the patchwork of German duchies, not by crushing them outright, but through a delicate balance of power. He married strategically, placed loyal bishops in key positions, and kept the great dukes engaged in the wider affairs of the realm. His military prowess was also significant, notably at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, where his forces defeated the Magyar raiders who had long threatened the empire's eastern frontier. It was a victory that brought a measure of peace and security, allowing the land to breathe and recover. In 962, Otto travelled to Rome, where Pope John XII crowned him emperor, reviving the imperial title that had lapsed since Charlemagne's line faded. Yet this was no simple restoration. The empire Otto ruled was not centred on Rome, nor was it Roman in administration. It was a distinctly Germanic realm, rooted in the traditions of East Francia, but given spiritual authority by the blessing of the Church. This union of crown and cross, of temporal and sacred responsibility, would define the Holy Roman Empire for centuries to come. Life within the empire, however, remained deeply local. The emperor's reach was long, but not always strong. Authority was shared, sometimes uneasily, with dukes, bishops, and abbots who governed their own territories with a degree of autonomy. In the countryside, peasants toiled in fields much as they had for generations. Their lives were marked by the rhythms of agriculture, the tolling of church bells, and the slow turning of the liturgical year. Easter and Christmas, planting and harvest, births, marriages, and deaths, all played out in the quiet corners of a realm that called itself an empire, yet felt more like a scattered collection of lives gently stitched together. The church played a central role in this era. Cathedrals rose in stone where once only wood and thatch had stood. Monasteries expanded, offering refuge, education, and medical care. The rule of Saint Benedict continued to shape monastic life, with its emphasis on ora et labora, prayer and work. Scribes in abbey scriptoria copied not only religious texts, but chronicles, charters, and legal treatises, helping to preserve a sense of continuity and order. The Ottonian dynasty, as it came to be known, ruled for nearly a century. Otto II and Otto III, while ambitious in their own ways, struggled to maintain the unity their forebears had achieved. Otto III, in particular, dreamed of a renewed Christian empire centred on Rome, drawing inspiration from classical antiquity. But his vision proved premature, and his early death in 1002 left the realm in a state of flux. It was under the next dynasty, the Salians, that the imperial office gained further definition. Conrad II, elected in 1024, worked to strengthen royal authority and reassert control over imperial lands. His son, Henry III, continued this work with diligence, and for a time the emperor stood at the peak of his power, able to appoint popes, mediate disputes, and oversee a realm that stretched from the North Sea to southern Italy. Yet even in this period of apparent unity, tensions simmered. The very idea of a Holy Roman Empire contained within it a quiet contradiction. That the emperor, a lay ruler, might also claim spiritual authority, even as the Church sought to remain sovereign in its own sphere. These tensions would erupt in the next century in what became known as the investiture controversy, a prolonged and often bitter conflict between emperors and popes over who held the right to appoint bishops and invest them with the symbols of office. At its heart, the dispute was about more than ceremony. It was about the nature of power, the balance between sacred and secular, and the extent to which the emperor might shape the soul of his realm. Gregory VII, the reforming pope, and Henry IV, the determined emperor, clashed in a series of letters, edicts, and eventually confrontations. In 1077, Henry's dramatic penance at Canossa, where he stood barefoot in the snow to seek absolution from the Pope, became a symbol of the complex dance between humility and authority that would define the empire's spiritual politics. While the high drama played out in Rome and royal courts, the daily life of the empire's subjects continued in its quiet cadence. Villages slowly grew into towns, trade began to trickle along old Roman roads, and guilds formed to protect the interests of artisans and merchants. Stone replaced wood in many churches, and the Romanesque style, with its rounded arches and sturdy walls, gave a sense of permanence to the spiritual life of the people. German became more widespread as a written language, though Latin remained dominant in official and ecclesiastical matters. Dialects varied widely, and most people rarely travelled far from their birthplace. Yet a sense of shared identity began to form, not as a nation, but as a people who prayed under the same rites, paid homage to the same emperor, and measured time by the same holy feasts. The early centuries of the Holy Roman Empire were thus not marked by swift changes or singular events. They were an era of slow layering, of custom upon tradition, of local governance under imperial canopy, of sacred duty entwined with worldly care. The empire was less a state than a framework, a way of organizing many different lives under a common vision, however imperfectly realized. And so in these early days the Holy Roman Empire moved not with the speed of conquest, but with the solemn pace of ceremony and season, a quiet vastness held together by oath, altar, and the gentle passage of time. As the Holy Roman Empire settled into its long and intricate form, the centuries between the 11th and 14th brought about a slow but perceptible change in the texture of life within its bounds. While the emperor's authority remained symbolically paramount, it was increasingly within the towns, the abbeys, and the villages that the real rhythms of life were felt and followed. It was an age of continuity more than transformation, of slow building walls, market squares, and the gently gathering pulse of civic life. This chapter, then, is not about battles or coronations, but about the steady heartbeat of daily existence in medieval Germany. At the centre of this world stood the town, or Stadt, rising modestly from the landscape, often enclosed by walls of stone or timber, with a gate at each cardinal point and narrow lanes that wound their way through clusters of steep-roofed houses. Towns were not numerous at first, but their importance grew steadily. Many were founded deliberately by lords or bishops, granted a Stadtrecht, or town charter, that allowed for a degree of autonomy. These charters specified market rights, judicial privileges, and self-governance by elected councils. They offered security and opportunity in an age where rural life remained subject to the uncertainties of harvest, weather, and war. Within these towns, life was defined by trade, craft, and community. The marketplace was the heart of it all. A broad, open square where traders laid out their goods beneath canvas awnings. On market days, the air was filled with the murmur of voices, the clatter of hooves, the fragrance of spices and fish and fresh bread. Bakers sold loaves shaped by hand and hearth. Cobblers mended boots beside displays of coarse woolen tunics and linen shifts. A blacksmith's forge might hiss and clang nearby, and the bell of the town church would toll softly above it all, marking the hours of prayer and passage. Craftsmen formed guilds, associations that protected their skills and upheld their standards. There were guilds for weavers, tanners, coopers, and masons, each with its own rules, feasts, and patron saints. Apprentices served long years under masters, learning their trade not through books, but by hand and repetition. Guilds were not only economic bodies, but also social ones, offering support in sickness, mourning, and festival. The houses themselves were timber-framed, with upper stories that jutted out over the lanes. Inside, families lived closely, often with their workshop below and living quarters above. Windows were small, and glass was rare. Panes, when present, were thick and bubbled, set into leaded frames. Lighting came from rushlights or tallow candles, and warmth from a hearth that rarely went cold. Water was drawn from wells or fountains, and sanitation was rudimentary. Chamber pots were emptied into the street, and waste ran down shallow gutters. Illness, when it came, spread quickly, and healers worked with herbs and prayers more often than with knowledge we might now call scientific. Yet, despite these hardships, there was a strong sense of rhythm and order. The church structured life through its calendar, and the year was divided into periods of fasting and feast, penance and celebration. Lent and Advent gave way to Easter and Christmas. Saints' days brought processions and fairs, each with its own colour and custom. Beyond the towns, in the broad countryside, village life continued with quiet endurance. Most people, over 90%, lived not in towns but in rural communities, working the land their ancestors had worked before them. The village was a small world, a collection of cottages, a church, a manor house or two, and the fields that surrounded them. These fields were often part of an open field system, divided into long strips, allocated to families, and rotated seasonally between crops and fallow. Ploughing was done with heavy wooden ploughs, often pulled by oxen. Sowing was by hand, and harvest required the cooperation of many. Scythes swinging in the sun, bundles stacked into stooks, and grain threshed upon wooden floors. It was hard work, made heavier by the knowledge that a poor harvest could mean hunger and a harsh winter, suffering. Yet it was also a communal life, where neighbours helped one another. Disputes were settled by custom and consensus, and the land was both livelihood and legacy. The church was present here too, not only in stone buildings and priestly offices, but in the very fabric of belief. God was everywhere, in the wind, the rain, the growth of wheat, and the fortunes of livestock. The priest was often the only literate man in the village, responsible for baptisms, marriages, and the care of souls. Sermons were delivered in Latin, though explained in the vernacular. Bells marked the Angelus, and processions honoured the Virgin or the local saint whose relics lay beneath the altar. Education was limited. Some sons of merchants or nobles might learn to read, perhaps even attend a cathedral school. But for most, learning was oral, songs, prayers, and the slow absorption of wisdom through experience. Time was not measured by clocks, but by the position of the sun, the ringing of bells, and the changing of the seasons. Night fell with the dusk, and households drew in together around the hearth, sharing food, stories, and silence. Life was not without danger. Famine could visit with cruel regularity. Fire, once sparked, could consume entire villages. War, though less frequent than legend might suggest, brought disruption and fear when it came. Yet people adapted. They relied on one another, on their faith, and on the slow but enduring traditions passed from parent to child. Marriage was more a contract than a romance, and family ties were essential not only for love but for survival. Women's roles, though often confined by custom, were vital. They managed households, raised children, prepared food, and often helped with planting and harvest. In towns, they worked alongside husbands in workshops or ran stalls in the market. Some, especially widows, owned property or managed estates. Nuns lived lives of prayer and service in convents, often with considerable learning and influence. Festivals brought moments of colour and release. Carnival, with its masks and mischief, preceded the solemnity of Lent. May Day celebrated the renewal of life. Weddings were cause for music and feasting, and the Feast of Corpus Christi brought the whole town into the streets in processions of flowers and incense. In these medieval centuries, then, the Holy Roman Empire was less a political map than a lived experience of bells and bread, frost and festival. Power lay not only in thrones or palaces, but in guild halls, monastic libraries, and village greens. And beneath it all was the steady hum of ordinary life, unrecorded by chronicles, but no less significant. The peasant sowing barley in the misty dawn, the weaver bent over his loom, the nun at her prayers before dawn, all lived lives full of meaning, rooted deeply in place and guided by the soft hand of time. So, let us linger here, just a little longer, among the quiet courtyards and echoing cloisters, in the stillness of a world whose pace may have been slower, but whose moments were no less rich. By the early 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire had become a sprawling and uneven realm, a patchwork of territories, each with its own laws, rulers, and customs, held loosely under the imperial crown. It was a world where tradition weighed heavily, where church and state were deeply entwined, and where the rhythms of life still followed the ecclesiastical calendar. But even within this familiar structure, quiet murmurs had begun to stir. Discontent, long simmering beneath the surface, now sought voice. And in a small Saxon town, nestled amid the wooded hills and winding rivers of central Germany, that voice would be found in a monk named Martin Luther. The church, by this time, was a central presence in every aspect of life, from the smallest village chapel to the soaring cathedrals of Cologne and Mainz. Its influence reached deep. It administered rites of passage, baptism, marriage, burial, and defined the moral order, but it was also, increasingly, a worldly institution. Bishops were often nobles, more attuned to politics than pastoral care. Church offices were sometimes sold, and the accumulation of wealth in monasteries and bishoprics stood in quiet contrast to the poverty of many of the faithful. One of the more visible points of friction was the sale of indulgences. Documents sold by church officials promising the reduction of time in purgatory for the purchaser or their loved ones. Intended as a means to encourage repentance and good works, indulgences had become, in practice, a means of raising funds, most notably for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In towns and cities across Germany, preachers proclaimed their benefits, and coins clinked into coffers, while unease quietly gathered. Luther, a theology professor at the University of Wittenberg and an Augustinian monk, was both devout and troubled. His studies of Scripture had led him to question not only the practice of indulgences, but the deeper theological assumptions behind them. In 1517 he composed 95 theses, points for academic debate written in Latin, and, according to tradition, posted them on the door of Wittenberg's castle church. Whether the hammer truly rang out or not, the effect was unmistakable. The theses were copied, translated into German, and distributed widely, thanks to the newly developed printing press. a quiet revolution in itself. What began as a call for reform quickly became something larger. Luther argued that salvation came through faith alone, sola fide, and not through works or purchased grace. He questioned the authority of the Pope, emphasized scripture over church tradition, and proposed that all believers had access to God without priestly mediation. These were not just theological ideas, they were challenges to the entire structure of religious life in the empire. Responses came swiftly. Church authorities condemned his teachings. The Pope excommunicated him. And in 1521, Luther was summoned before the Diet of Worms, an imperial assembly presided over by Emperor Charles V. There, asked to recant, he famously declared, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Though declared an outlaw, he was protected by sympathetic princes, most notably Frederick the Wise of Saxony, and spirited away to Wartburg Castle, where he spent months in hiding, translating the New Testament into German. Luther's translation was not just a religious act, it was a cultural one. For the first time, ordinary German speakers could read scripture in their own tongue, drawing their own interpretations and deepening their personal faith. The language he used, clear, direct, and rooted in everyday speech, helped to shape modern German itself. It was a quiet but profound shift as the spoken word of the people found its way into the printed page of the sacred. The Reformation, as it came to be known, spread rapidly. Preachers across the empire adopted Luther's teachings, towns introduced reforms, monasteries were dissolved, and altars were stripped of their ornaments. Hymns were sung in the vernacular, priests married, and the idea of a direct, unmediated relationship with God began to take root. Yet this was no simple or peaceful transition. The empire, already diverse in its structures, now became fragmented in faith as well. Some regions embraced the new doctrines eagerly, while others remained staunchly Catholic. The emperor, committed to preserving unity, struggled to contain the growing division, and beneath the theological debates, deeper social tensions emerged. In 1524, the German Peasants' War broke out, an uprising inspired in part by the language of freedom and reform. Though Luther condemned the violence, many peasants had looked to him as a champion. Their defeat was brutal, and the memory of the rebellion lingered, a silent wound across the countryside. Meanwhile, other reformers began to emerge: Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, John Calvin in Geneva, each offering their own interpretations and structures. The Reformation fractured further into Lutheran, Reformed, and eventually Anabaptist strands. Religious diversity became a feature of life in the empire, but also a source of persistent tension. Families were divided, churches were repurposed, and the once uniform rhythm of worship gave way to local variation. In daily life, these changes were felt not as abstractions, but in the details of parish and practice. The Latin Mass gave way to German services. Images of saints were removed, replaced by plain walls and scripture. Confessionals were dismantled. Festivals were reinterpreted or, in some places, abolished altogether. The year no longer moved to the same calendar everywhere. Yet for many, faith deepened. Sermons became central, congregational singing flourished, and the Bible took on a new personal significance. The role of the printing press cannot be overstated. Pamphlets, catechisms, and translated scriptures circulated widely, read aloud in taverns, workshops, and homes. Woodcuts illustrated complex ideas for those who could not read. Dialogue and debate became common, not only in universities, but in marketplaces and inns. A literate laity began to emerge, and with it, a more engaged sense of personal belief. Women, too, found new roles in this shifting world. While formal leadership remained male-dominated, The Protestant emphasis on marriage and family elevated the role of the pastor's wife. Women like Katharina von Bora, Luther's own spouse, managed households, supported their husbands' ministries, and contributed to the moral and educational fabric of their communities. Yet for all its energy, the Reformation was also an unsettling time. The old certainties had been shaken. Religious uniformity, once assumed, gave way to confessional boundaries. Tolerance, as we now understand it, was not yet born. Each community sought to shape itself according to its chosen faith, and those who dissented were often marginalized or expelled. Jews, in particular, faced renewed hostility, with both Catholic and Protestant leaders expressing views that darkened the course of European history. By the mid-16th century, the Peace of Augsburg sought to bring some stability. Signed in 1555, it allowed each prince within the empire to determine the religion of his territory, cuius regio, ius religio. It was a pragmatic solution, though an imperfect one. Religious difference was now part of the imperial landscape, not as a temporary crisis, but as a permanent feature. And so the Reformation did not end with Luther's theses, nor with his death in 1546. It continued quietly, steadily, through sermons, schools, family prayers, and the silent reading of Scripture by candlelight. It reshaped the Holy Roman Empire not through conquest or decree, but through conviction and community. The empire endured, but it was no longer the same. Its unity had been tempered by diversity, its faith refracted into many forms, and its people drawn into new patterns of thought and worship. In this way, a quiet monk from Wittenberg had helped to change the course of history, not by force, but by words, by questions, and by the enduring power of belief. By the early 17th century, the Holy Roman Empire stood as a realm both venerable and vulnerable, a delicate lattice of duchies, free cities, principalities, and bishoprics, each carrying its own history, loyalties, and increasingly its own confessional identity. The Peace of Augsburg, signed in 1555, had offered a fragile settlement to the empire's religious divisions, granting rulers the right to determine their territory's faith. But time, as it so often does, moved forward with complexity rather than resolution. New generations of rulers inherited old suspicions. Theological disagreements deepened. Political ambitions stirred beneath the surface. And so, almost quietly at first, Europe drifted towards one of its most protracted and devastating conflicts, the 30 Years' War. The spark came in 1618, in the Bohemian city of Prague. There, in a scene that would echo through history, a group of Protestant nobles confronted imperial representatives in the royal castle and, after a tense exchange, cast them out of a window. Miraculously, they survived the fall, landing in a moat as it happened. But the act, known as the Defenestration of Prague, marked the beginning of open hostilities between Protestant and Catholic factions within the empire. What followed was not a single, linear war, but a long, episodic series of conflicts, fought across shifting alliances and changing motivations. Religion was at its core, but politics, territory, and dynastic rivalry soon became entangled in the struggle. The empire, already complex in structure, became a theatre for larger European ambitions, drawing in powers such as Spain, France, Sweden, and Denmark. Battles were fought not only for faith, but for influence, prestige, and survival. For the people of the German lands, the war brought a kind of slow, grinding misery. Armies marched across fields and through towns, requisitioning food, lodging, and horses. Where they went, they left damage, not always through malice, but often through need. Soldiers were poorly paid and poorly fed, and looting became commonplace. Civilians bore the brunt of it. Crops were trampled, livestock slaughtered, granaries emptied. Homes were burned not in fury, but to deny shelter to the enemy. In many places, famine followed. Fields went unploughed, orchards untended. Starvation became a real and present danger. People fled their homes, taking what little they could carry, seeking refuge in walled towns or distant relatives' cottages. Disease spread swiftly through displaced populations. Typhus, dysentery and plague reappeared, carried on the backs of war and want. In some regions, entire villages vanished, either destroyed outright or abandoned through despair. It was a war that rarely stood still. Armies came and went, fronts shifted, and peace seemed always just out of reach. Some battles were large and decisive, others small and bitter. The siege of Magdeburg in 1631 remains one of the darkest moments. An imperial army sacked the Protestant city with such violence that over 20,000 civilians were killed. The destruction was not planned, but once begun, it became a horror difficult to contain. Flames consumed homes and churches alike, and survivors told of screams that echoed for days. Yet amidst the devastation, life did not vanish. It adapted. In quieter corners of the empire, farmers continued to till what land they could. Markets, though diminished, remained. Priests and pastors offered solace. Children were born, baptized, and buried. The human need for continuity, for something enduring in the face of ruin, kept a certain rhythm alive. Families huddled by fires, told stories, and prayed for peace. Religion remained both a cause and a comfort. Protestants sang psalms in ruined chapels. Catholics carried saints' relics from town to town, seeking divine protection. But faith, too, began to change. In some places, the war dulled theological passions, replacing them with fatigue. In others, it deepened resolve. But everywhere, it reshaped the way people thought about power, authority, and divine favor. The war's later stages were marked increasingly by foreign intervention. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, a devout Lutheran and skilled general, entered the conflict in 1630, bringing with him a disciplined army and a vision of Protestant protection. His presence shifted the balance, if only briefly. He died in battle at Lutzen in 1632, and though his death was mourned by many, the war continued. France, though Catholic, joined the conflict on the Protestant side, not from theological sympathy, but from a desire to curtail Habsburg power. This move marked a turning point, shifting the war's center of gravity from religion to geopolitics. The lines between good and bad, saint and sinner, became increasingly blurred. Soldiers fought less for faith and more for survival, for pay, or for promises of land and favor. By the 1640s, after decades of conflict, exhaustion had set in. The war had become a burden for all sides. Economies were shattered, towns lay in ruin, populations had dwindled. Negotiations began, first cautiously, then with greater purpose. They culminated in the Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648 in the Westphalian towns of Münster and Osnabrück. It was not a grand victory for anyone, but a series of compromises, an agreement that no one could win outright, and that coexistence, however uneasy, was preferable to endless ruin. The peace reaffirmed the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, allowing rulers to determine their territory's faith, now including Calvinism, alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism. It recognized the sovereignty of individual states within the empire, limiting the emperor's power further and laying the groundwork for the modern concept of statehood. The Holy Roman Empire survived, but in a looser, more fragmented form. For the people, the end of the war brought relief. but not immediate recovery. Fields had to be resown, towns rebuilt, and communities restored. Wounds, both visible and unseen, lingered. A generation had grown up knowing nothing but conflict. Some regions had lost a third, even half, of their population. Records from the time speak of ghost villages, of wolves returning to once cultivated lands, and of silence where bells once rang. And yet, as always, life returned. Slowly, carefully, the land was cleared, marriages arranged, and churches rededicated. The dead were mourned, the living baptized. Music and laughter returned, first in fragments, then in fuller voice. The human spirit, though battered, was not extinguished. The 30 Years' War left an indelible mark on the German lands, not only in terms of loss, but in shaping how identity, belief, and governance would be understood. It tempered the empire's sense of itself, shifting it from imperial ambition to regional resilience. The memory of it would linger in folk songs, sermons, and the careful caution of rulers for generations to come. And so, as we leave this shadowed chapter behind, let us pause for a moment in the stillness that follows a storm, in the quiet of a village slowly reawakening, as mist rises from a broken field and the first signs of peace take root once more. As the 18th century opened over the German lands, the Holy Roman Empire continued to endure, less as a cohesive state and more as a broad framework of countless overlapping jurisdictions. Bishops ruled over cities, dukes over regions, and the emperor, though still symbolically paramount, held little direct control over many parts of the realm. It was a quiet, complex order, kept alive by habit, custom, and the slow rhythms of governance. But within this settled pattern, something new was beginning to stir. A kingdom once considered peripheral, cold, sandy, and sparsely populated, was beginning its long ascent. Prussia, disciplined and determined, was rising. The roots of Prussia's emergence lay in the 17th century with the House of Hohenzollern, a dynasty that had governed the small and modest electorate of Brandenburg from its capital in Berlin. Through a series of strategic marriages and inheritances, the Hohenzollerns came to rule not only Brandenburg but also the Duchy of Prussia, a region once governed by the Teutonic Knights and later a Polish fief. Though these territories were non-contiguous and culturally diverse, the family managed to stitch them into a coherent polity, grounded in a shared sense of duty, hierarchy, and military discipline. The defining figure in this early rise was Frederick William, known as the Great Elector. Ruling from 1640 to 1688, he was not a king, but he laid the groundwork for Prussian identity. Centralized governance, a standing army, and a careful balancing of noble privilege with royal authority. He welcomed refugees, especially French Huguenots fleeing religious persecution, bringing skilled artisans and traders to his cities. His policies were not flamboyant, but they were consistent, and they left behind a stronger, more unified state. It was his grandson, Frederick I, who secured the royal title. In 1701, with the approval of the Holy Roman Emperor, he crowned himself King in Prussia, a careful phrasing reflecting the fact that Prussia lay outside the formal borders of the empire. The moment passed quietly by European standards, but it marked the beginning of something significant. A kingdom within the German lands that was not bound by the ancient structure of the empire, but that would eventually come to challenge and reshape it. The real transformation came under his son, Frederick William I, the Soldier King, who ruled from 1713 to 1740. Austere, industrious, and somewhat eccentric, he had little time for ceremony or courtly splendor. He dismissed the royal orchestra, scorned French fashions, and preferred a life of rigorous simplicity. but he also built one of the most formidable standing armies in Europe, not large by sheer numbers, but highly trained, efficiently supplied, and deeply woven into the fabric of Prussian society. Military service became a defining feature of Prussian life. The Junkers, the landed aristocracy, were granted privileges in exchange for serving as officers. Towns contributed recruits, and even peasant families understood that the rhythm of their sons' lives would likely pass through the drill square. Yet Frederick William did not wage war recklessly. He used his army more as a tool of deterrence and diplomacy, investing his energies instead in administrative reform, financial prudence, and the expansion of infrastructure. His son, however, would prove both a continuation and a departure. Frederick II, known to history as Frederick the Great, came to the throne in 1740, and with him, Prussia stepped boldly into the European stage. Educated, eloquent, and enamored of French culture, Frederick had once clashed bitterly with his father, who considered his artistic inclinations a sign of weakness. Yet when he became king, he proved to be a ruler of both intellect and action. His first act was war. That same year, the Habsburg ruler Charles VI died, and his daughter Maria Theresa sought to inherit his titles and lands. Frederick, seeing an opportunity, marched his troops into Silesia, a wealthy Habsburg province, and seized it. Thus began the War of the Austrian Succession, the first of several conflicts in which Prussia would fight not as a minor power, but as a major player. Under Frederick's leadership, Prussia became known not just for its army, but for its governance. He corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, promoted religious tolerance, and reformed the legal code. He supported education, encouraged scientific inquiry, and envisioned a rational state, orderly, efficient, and governed by reason. He saw himself as the first servant of the state, a phrase that reflected his belief in duty over privilege. Yet Prussia was never merely a land of ideals. Its governance remained hierarchical, its society stratified. The Junkers retained their dominance in rural areas, and the peasants, though protected from some abuses, remained tied to their lords. Berlin, though increasingly a centre of thought and administration, was not yet a cosmopolitan capital in the mould of Paris or Vienna. Prussia's strength lay not in its grandeur, but in its discipline, a quality that would shape its path well into the modern age. Elsewhere in the empire, the Enlightenment was taking root in quieter forms. In universities like Göttingen and Heidelberg, scholars debated philosophy and natural law. In salons and coffee houses, ideas of reason, liberty, and progress began to circulate. The works of Kant, Lessing, and Goethe introduced a distinctly German voice to the wider European conversation. Art, literature, and science flourished in tandem, though always with a certain restraint, more contemplative than exuberant. In the countryside, life continued much as it had for centuries. Fields were ploughed, churches filled on Sundays, and the seasons turned with predictable regularity. The reforms of enlightened rulers were often slow to reach the village hearth, but over time the influence was felt in the establishment of schools, the standardization of weights and measures, the simplification of laws. The old world was not erased, but it was gently reshaped. Religious tolerance promoted by rulers like Frederick and Joseph II of Austria reduced the worst forms of sectarian division. Jews, long marginalized, found slightly more space in urban economies, though full emancipation remained distant. Serfdom, still present in many parts of the empire, came under increasing scrutiny, though it would take more than the Enlightenment to end it fully. The Holy Roman Empire, meanwhile, persisted, less as a political force and more as a ceremonial scaffold. Its emperor, by this time always a Habsburg, presided over an increasingly symbolic realm. The real power lay elsewhere, in the courts of Berlin, Vienna, and Munich, in the chancelleries and ministries of ambitious kings and princes. By the close of the 18th century, the German lands were a mixture of old and new, traditional in structure, yet touched by reform, deeply regional, yet slowly absorbing the language of common identity. Prussia had risen not as a replacement for the empire, but as a model of a different kind of order, one that combined military strength with enlightened governance. And so, beneath the candle-lit pages of philosophy, the rattle of muskets on parade grounds, and the quiet reform of village schools, a new chapter in German history was quietly forming, waiting, as ever, for the next turn of the page. As the 19th century approached, the Holy Roman Empire lingered on in name, its institutions venerable, yet increasingly hollow. It was a realm bound more by tradition than by power. Its emperor, by now always drawn from the Habsburg house, sitting atop a mosaic of independent duchies, bishoprics, and free cities. Beneath this layered surface, however, Europe was stirring. Revolutionary winds, first sweeping through France in the late 18th century, were beginning to unsettle even the most settled corners of the German lands. And into this shifting landscape stepped a figure who would change the shape of Europe and Germany with both ambition and resolve: Napoleon Bonaparte. The French Revolution of 1789 had sent shockwaves across the continent. The monarchy had fallen, aristocratic privileges abolished, and the language of liberty, equality, and fraternity had begun to circulate far beyond France's borders. German intellectuals, many of them steeped in Enlightenment ideals, watched with a mixture of hope and apprehension. But for the rulers of the empire, the revolution presented a threat, not just of ideas, but of armies. In the 1790s, revolutionary France found itself at war with much of Europe, including the Austrian Habsburgs. Battles were fought across the Rhine and into southern Germany. Territories changed hands, alliances shifted, and many of the smaller imperial states found themselves caught between greater powers. French victories, particularly under the leadership of Napoleon, brought not only military occupation, but sweeping administrative reforms. Feudal privileges were abolished, legal codes simplified, and in many cases, religious institutions secularized. The old Holy Roman Empire, with its complex hierarchy and overlapping jurisdictions, found itself increasingly irrelevant. In 1806, following Napoleon's decisive victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, Emperor Francis II formally dissolved the empire, assuming instead the title of Emperor of Austria. The empire, which had endured in some form for nearly a millennium, faded quietly into history, its disappearance marked not by catastrophe, but by inevitability. In its place, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states aligned with France and organized along more rational lines. Borders were redrawn, bureaucracies streamlined, and French influence permeated legal and educational systems. While many Germans resented foreign domination, others welcomed the changes, seeing in them a path toward modernization. Resistance, however, began to grow. Prussia, humiliated by its defeat at Jena Auerstedt in 1806, embarked on a series of military and administrative reforms. Officers were promoted by merit rather than birth. Education was expanded, and a sense of national purpose began to take root. Meanwhile, cultural figures such as Johann Gottlieb Fichte called for a renewal of German spirit, an awakening not of political revolution, but of inward resolve. The turning point came with Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia in 1812. As French forces faltered and retreated, German states began to break away from his influence. Prussia, Austria, and other former allies now turned against him. The Wars of Liberation, as they came to be known in Germany, culminated in the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, a vast and bloody engagement that saw Napoleon decisively defeated by a coalition of European powers. Following his abdication in 1814 and again in 1815 after Waterloo, the map of Europe was redrawn at the Congress of Vienna. The German lands, no longer united by the Holy Roman Empire nor fully dominated by France, were reorganized into a new entity, the German Confederation. This confederation, established in 1815, was a loose association of 39 German states, ranging from large powers like Austria and Prussia to tiny principalities and free cities. It was not a nation, nor even a centralized federation, but a diplomatic framework designed to preserve peace, balance power, and prevent the rise of any single dominant state. Its governing body, the Federal Assembly, met in Frankfurt, but had no independent military or taxing authority. Austria, as the presiding power, sought to maintain the conservative order established at Vienna. Prince Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian statesman, became the leading voice of this new order, emphasizing stability, monarchy, and resistance to liberal change. Prussia, though nominally a partner, often pursued its own interests, strengthening its hold over the northern and eastern German territories. Beneath the surface, however, quiet currents of change continued. The experience of Napoleonic rule had left a mark, not only in laws and institutions, but in memory. The idea of German unity, once a poetic or philosophical notion, had begun to take firmer shape. Writers and thinkers such as Herder, Schlegel, and the early Romantics celebrated the shared language, history, and cultural heritage of the German people. Though political unity remained distant, cultural nationalism began to spread through schools, songs, and the slow growth of a common identity. Economically, the Confederation presided over a period of significant transformation. The early 1800s saw the beginnings of industrial development, modest at first, but accelerating as the century progressed. Railways began to link cities and towns. Coal mining expanded in the Ruhr and Saxony, and textile production increased in Silesia and Württemberg. These changes brought not only prosperity, but dislocation. Rural populations moved to urban centres, traditional trades declined, and a new working class began to form. To ease trade and promote economic cooperation, Prussia initiated the Zollverein in the 1830s, a customs union that gradually expanded to include most of the German states, excluding Austria. The Zollverein eliminated internal tariffs and standardized weights, measures, and currencies. It was an economic unification that foreshadowed political possibilities, quietly knitting the German lands closer together under Prussian leadership. Yet the political order remained fragile. Calls for constitutional government, civil liberties, and national unity grew louder, especially among students and the middle classes. In 1832, thousands gathered at the Hambach Festival, waving black, red, and gold banners, the colours that would later symbolize German unity. Their speeches called not for revolution, but for reform, for representation, for a Germany that could speak with one voice. The authorities responded with censorship and surveillance. Metternich's system of control sought to suppress dissent, but the desire for change could not be extinguished. It lived on in pamphlets passed hand to hand, in whispered debates in university halls, and in the quiet confidence of those who believed that the German people, so long divided, might yet find a way to come together. And so the Napoleonic era, though tumultuous and foreign-led, served as a kind of catalyst. It ended one order, disrupted another, and planted the seeds of something not yet realized. The German lands, once held loosely under imperial ceremony, were now bound by trade, by memory, and by the beginnings of a shared hope. The question of unity had not been answered, but it had, at last, been asked. And in the quiet towns and busy cities of the Confederation, in the echo of railway whistles and the rustle of printed verse, the future continued to unfold. One thought, one journey, one conversation at a time. As the mid-19th century approached, the German Confederation stood at a quiet crossroads. Its structure, deliberately loose, almost hesitant, had kept the peace since the fall of Napoleon, but it had not resolved the deeper tensions simmering beneath the surface. The yearning for national unity, for a Germany defined not by diplomacy but by shared purpose, had grown stronger. Yet unity remained elusive, pulled this way by Austria, that way by Prussia, and always tempered by caution. Into this world stepped a man both pragmatic and relentless, a figure whose approach was neither poetic nor idealistic, but grounded in calculation and will. His name was Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck, born in 1815 on a Pomeranian estate, had studied law and served in various diplomatic posts before rising to prominence. He was not, at first, the obvious architect of unification. His early speeches revealed a deep loyalty to monarchy and a suspicion of liberalism. Yet beneath the formality, he possessed a sharp mind, a gift for timing, and an instinctive understanding of power. In 1862, amid a constitutional crisis over military funding, King Wilhelm I of Prussia appointed him minister-president. Bismarck took the post, not with grand promises, but with a quiet, uncompromising purpose. In one of his earliest and most remembered speeches, he declared that the great questions of the day would not be decided by speeches and majority votes, but by iron and blood. It was not a call to arms, but a statement of political clarity. Bismarck believed that unification could not be achieved through sentiment or parliamentary debate alone. It would require strength, strategy, and a readiness to act decisively when the moment came. His first step was to strengthen Prussia internally. He worked to modernize the army, ensuring its readiness without conceding to liberal demands. He navigated Parliament with a mixture of defiance and delay, collecting taxes without full legislative approval, a constitutional grey area that would later be smoothed over by success. His vision was not of a democratic Germany, but of a unified state led by Prussia and shaped by calculated diplomacy. The path to unification passed through 3 carefully orchestrated wars, each designed not for conquest, but for positioning. The first, in 1864, was fought against Denmark over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, territories with both Danish and German ties. Bismarck allied with Austria, presenting a united front. The conflict was brief and successful. Denmark ceded both duchies, which were then jointly administered by the victors. But this alliance, as Bismarck intended, was not to last. Tensions over the governance of the duchies soon flared, and in 1866 Prussia and Austria went to war. The Austro-Prussian War, sometimes called the 7 Weeks' War, was swift and decisive. Prussian troops, well-trained and equipped with breech-loading rifles, defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Königgrätz. Bismarck, recognizing the moment, pushed for a generous peace. Austria was excluded from German affairs, but not humiliated. The German Confederation was dissolved, and in its place, Bismarck established the North German Confederation, a new political structure under Prussian leadership. This new confederation included most northern German states bound together by a common constitution, a federal parliament, and a shared army. It was, in many ways, a prototype for what would follow, but the south, particularly Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, remained outside. They were culturally and religiously distinct, and wary of Prussian dominance. Bismarck understood that they would not be coaxed into union by diplomacy alone. A final catalyst was needed. That catalyst came in 1870 through a delicate diplomatic incident known as the Ems Dispatch. A dispute over the Spanish throne had drawn French attention, and when a French envoy sought assurances from the Prussian king, Bismarck edited the king's polite response into a terser, more provocative version and released it to the press. The effect was immediate. France, feeling insulted, declared war, and with that, the Franco-Prussian War began. This third and final war was fought not for revenge or resources, but for unity. Southern German states, fearing French aggression and inspired by shared language and heritage, joined with the North German Confederation. Prussian forces advanced swiftly, and in January 1871, after a series of battles that culminated in the Siege of Paris, the German victory was complete. The symbolic moment came not on German soil, but in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. There, surrounded by German princes and military leaders, Wilhelm I was proclaimed German Emperor, Deutscher Kaiser. Bismarck, clad not in courtly garb but a field marshal's uniform, stood quietly to the side. His vision had been realized. The new German Empire was a federal monarchy composed of kingdoms, grand duchies, principalities, and city-states, each retaining a degree of autonomy. Prussia remained dominant, its king now emperor, its army the backbone of the Reich, its chancellor, Bismarck himself, the architect of policy. Yet for all its strength, it was a cautious unity. The empire was a compromise, a collection of sovereignties bound together not by revolution but by realism. Life within the new empire settled into a steady rhythm. Railways expanded, factories multiplied, and cities grew. Berlin became a bustling capital, while Hamburg and Munich flourished in trade and culture. German universities led the world in science and philosophy. The economy, driven by coal, steel, and engineering, surged ahead. Yet beneath this prosperity, tensions lingered. Bismarck, ever the strategist, moved to stabilize the state through domestic policy. He introduced social welfare measures, health insurance, accident insurance, and pensions, designed not from altruism but to preempt socialist demands. He also enacted the Kulturkampf, a campaign to reduce Catholic influence in state affairs, though this was eventually softened in response to political realities. Throughout it all, Bismarck remained a figure of control. He managed foreign policy with care, balancing alliances to prevent encirclement and avoid unnecessary wars. He saw Germany not as a crusading power, but as a satisfied one, strong but cautious. Germany is satiated, he would later say, urging restraint. In 1890, following a dispute with the new Emperor Wilhelm II, Bismarck was dismissed. He retired to his estate, watching with wary eyes as the empire he had shaped continued without him. He died 8 years later, a towering yet quietly receding figure in German history. The unification of Germany under Bismarck was not inevitable. It was the product of timing, will, and an unflinching sense of purpose. It reshaped the map of Europe, altered the balance of power, and gave the German people a new, if still complex, sense of collective identity. And so, from the measured words of a Prussian diplomat through 3 short wars and into a nation born not in upheaval but in calculation, the idea of Germany had become real. Not merely a land, but a state. No longer whispered in poetry or debate, but spoken aloud in the still echoing halls of Versailles. With the proclamation of the German Empire in 1871, a new chapter quietly began, an era often referred to as Wilhelmine Germany, named for the emperors who bore the name Wilhelm. It was a period marked not by revolution or collapse, but by the steady unfolding of a modern state, industrial, imperial, and increasingly complex. Under its ceremonial surface lay the slow rhythms of social change, the hum of factories, the murmur of parliaments, and the quiet expansion of an identity still in the making. The empire, though newly formed, carried within it deep continuities. Its structure was federal, composed of 25 states, including 4 kingdoms: Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg. Each retained certain rights, and each had its own traditions and character. Prussia, however, dominated in both scale and influence, holding the imperial crown and providing most of the army, civil service, and leadership. Berlin, once a provincial capital, now stood as the heart of a unified German state. Wilhelm I, the first emperor, ruled with a careful hand, deferring often to Bismarck, his chancellor and the true architect of the empire's policy. Their partnership brought a certain stability, conservative, calculated, and resistant to change for its own sake. The Reichstag, or Imperial Parliament, was elected by universal male suffrage, a surprisingly progressive feature. Yet real power remained with the emperor, the Bundesrat, a council of state representatives, and the chancellor, who was not responsible to the Reichstag. Under Bismarck's guidance, the empire focused inward on consolidation, industrialization, and social policy. His Kulturkampf, an attempt to curtail Catholic influence, had met with resistance and was eventually softened. He then turned to the growing workers' movement, introducing social insurance schemes that made Germany a pioneer in welfare policy. His aim was not only to alleviate hardship, but to bind the working classes to the state. Economically, Germany entered a period of rapid transformation. The late 19th century saw the emergence of vast industrial complexes, particularly in the Ruhr and Saar regions. Coal and steel became the backbone of growth, while new technologies, chemicals, electricity, and eventually internal combustion propelled innovation. Railways crisscrossed the empire, linking towns and cities in a web of steel and steam. Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich expanded quickly, their skylines rising with chimneys and clock towers. The social fabric began to shift. A growing urban working class developed, living in tenement blocks and working long hours in factories and foundries. Labour unions began to organise, demanding fairer conditions and wages. The middle classes, teachers, clerks, small business owners, expanded as education spread and administrative needs grew. Meanwhile, the old aristocracy maintained its influence, especially in the military and rural politics. Education became a national priority. Gymnasien, grammar schools, prepared students for university, while technical schools trained engineers and artisans. Literacy rose steadily, and a shared language and curriculum began to shape a more cohesive cultural identity. German universities led in science, philosophy, and the humanities, drawing students from across Europe. Culturally, the Wilhelmine era was rich and varied. Music, theatre, and literature flourished. Composers like Brahms and Wagner were celebrated, while novelists such as Theodor Fontane explored the subtleties of German life. Art movements began to challenge traditional forms, and philosophical inquiry, especially in the work of Nietzsche, questioned the very foundations of morality and meaning. In 1888, the old emperor, Wilhelm I, died at the age of 90. His son, Friedrich III, succeeded him, but reigned for only 99 days before succumbing to illness. The crown then passed to Wilhelm II, a young and energetic ruler with grand ambitions. Unlike his grandfather, Wilhelm II had little patience for Bismarck's cautious diplomacy. Within 2 years, he forced the Chancellor's resignation, marking a shift in the tone and direction of the empire. Wilhelm II was both charismatic and impulsive. He saw Germany as a world power and sought a more assertive role on the global stage. His naval expansion, inspired by the British Royal Navy, aimed to project imperial influence abroad. This build-up, however, contributed to rising tensions with Britain and other powers. The Kaiser's flamboyant style and unpredictable statements often unsettled both allies and rivals. Under his rule, Germany expanded its colonial presence, acquiring territories in Africa, the Pacific, and China. These overseas holdings were modest compared to Britain or France, but they signaled a new direction. An empire seeking not just unity at home, but recognition abroad. Colonial policy, often administered harshly, brought both economic exploitation and cultural imposition, leaving legacies that would echo long after the empire's fall. Domestically, tensions grew. The Social Democratic Party, SPD, representing workers and promoting socialist ideals, gained strength in the Reichstag, becoming the largest party by 1912. Yet despite their electoral success, they held little real power, as the emperor and his ministers retained control of foreign policy and the military. This disjuncture between democratic appearance and autocratic reality would become increasingly difficult to sustain. The military remained a revered institution. The officer class, drawn largely from the Prussian aristocracy, upheld values of discipline, honor, and obedience. Military parades and uniforms became part of everyday life, not only as symbols of strength, but of national pride. Yet this emphasis on martial spirit also fostered a worldview centered on competition, rivalry, and preparedness for conflict. For many, the Wilhelmina era was a time of progress and promise. Streets were lit by electric lamps, telephones connected distant offices, and department stores offered goods from across the world. The postal system was efficient, the trains punctual, and public health steadily improving. A sense of order, ambition, and possibility prevailed. Yet there was also unease. Class divisions persisted. Regional identities, especially in Bavaria and Saxony, sometimes resisted Prussian dominance. Intellectuals debated the soul of the nation, torn between tradition and modernity, discipline and freedom. And in foreign affairs, alliances tightened, armies grew, and the space for negotiation shrank. By the early years of the 20th century, Germany stood at the center of a delicate European balance, powerful, confident, yet increasingly isolated. Its industrial might and scientific achievements were admired, even envied, but its political rigidity and assertive posture worried its neighbors. The empire was strong but not supple, proud but not always prudent. As the decade turned and new technologies emerged, aircraft, automobiles, wireless communication, a sense of acceleration took hold. Change was no longer seasonal or generational, but constant. The world was becoming faster, louder, and more crowded. Yet amid this modernity, the old order remained. An emperor on his throne, generals in their dress uniforms, and a state held together by tradition, ambition, and hope. It was an age of paradox, rich with promise, but shadowed by uncertainty. And as the empire moved forward, its path would soon intersect with the broader storm gathering over Europe, a storm that would shake not only the foundations of Germany, but of the entire continent it had come to shape. The summer of 1914 began, as many summers do, with warmth and a sense of routine. Across Germany, trains ran on time, schoolchildren played in village squares, and factories hummed with quiet confidence. The empire, now over 4 decades old, had grown accustomed to its place in the world, strong, efficient, and self-assured. Few could have imagined, as July unfolded, how quickly everything would change. Within a matter of weeks, the great powers of Europe were at war, and Germany, caught in the web of alliances and ambitions, found itself at the center of what would become the First World War. The spark, as is often remembered, came with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo. What followed was a rapid cascade of declarations, mobilizations, and diplomatic failures. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, issued its famous blank check of support. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. France, tied to Russia, followed suit. Britain, drawn by treaty obligations and concerns over Belgian neutrality, declared war soon after. What had begun as a regional crisis now enveloped an entire continent. At first, there was enthusiasm. Crowds gathered in the streets, waving flags and singing patriotic songs. Young men volunteered in great numbers, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. Newspapers spoke of duty and destiny, but the war that followed bore little resemblance to the glories of past campaigns. It was not swift, nor noble, nor clean. On the Western Front, German forces moved through Belgium into France, expecting a quick victory. Instead, they encountered entrenched resistance. The war settled into a stalemate of trenches, barbed wire, and mud. Soldiers lived for months in dugouts, exposed to artillery, snipers, and disease. The landscape became a grey ruin, trees reduced to stumps, villages to rubble, and lives to statistics. In the east, against Russia, the war was more fluid, yet no less brutal. Battles such as Tannenberg brought early victories, but the front lines stretched vast and uncertain across forests and plains. Austria-Hungary struggled, and Germany found itself increasingly carrying the burden of alliance. At home, the war demanded total mobilization. Industry shifted to arms production, food was rationed, and the population endured increasing hardship. The British naval blockade restricted imports, leading to shortages of meat, bread, and essentials. The winter of 1916-17 became known as the Turnip Winter, when the humble root became a staple out of necessity rather than choice. Women took on new roles, working in munitions factories, serving as nurses, and keeping families together, while husbands and sons fought at the front. Their presence in public life grew, even as the old structures of authority persisted. Children, too, felt the war's reach, through absent fathers, rationed meals, and the ever-present tone of solemnity. Propaganda framed the conflict as a struggle for survival, for honor, for civilization itself. Yet, as the months turned to years, disillusionment grew. Letters from the front spoke of horror and monotony. Soldiers returned on leave, haunted and hollow-eyed. Anti-war voices, once marginal, gained strength, though they were often censored or suppressed. In 1917, the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies, tipping the balance. Meanwhile, Russia, consumed by revolution, withdrew. Germany, desperate for a decisive victory, launched a final offensive in the spring of 1918. It advanced rapidly, but soon faltered. The Allied counterattack, now supported by American troops and equipment, pushed German forces back. By the autumn, it was clear that the war could not be won. the military command advised the civilian government to seek an armistice. On the 9th of November 1918, Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The monarchy, centuries old, ended quietly, without ceremony. 2 days later, on the 11th of November, the armistice was signed. The war was over. In the wake of defeat, Germany found itself adrift. The old order had vanished, and something new was needed. Amid strikes, protests, and political uncertainty, a republic was declared from a balcony in Weimar, a city chosen for its cultural rather than political associations. The Weimar Republic, as it came to be known, was born not of revolution, but of necessity. Its early years were turbulent. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms: territorial losses, military restrictions, and heavy reparations. Many Germans saw it not as peace, but as punishment. The war guilt clause, which assigned sole responsibility for the conflict to Germany, became a source of lasting resentment. Economically, the Republic faced immense challenges. Inflation soared, especially in the early 1920s, culminating in the hyperinflation of 1923. Paper money lost value by the hour, savings evaporated, bartering returned. Middle-class families, once stable, found themselves impoverished. Yet amidst the hardship, there was resilience. A new currency stabilized the economy, and by the mid-1920s, a fragile prosperity returned. Politically, the Republic was a democracy, with a president, parliament, and a constitution admired for its clarity. Yet it operated in a climate of mistrust. Extremist parties, both left and right, rejected its legitimacy. The communist uprising in Berlin and the right-wing Kapp Putsch in 1920 were early signs of fragility. The new state relied heavily on compromise, coalition, and constant negotiation. Culturally, however, Weimar Germany flourished. Berlin became a center of modernity, its streets filled with jazz, cabaret, cinema, and avant-garde art. Figures like Bertolt Brecht, Marlene Dietrich, and Walter Gropius brought new energy to theatre, film, and architecture. The Bauhaus movement reimagined space and form. Writers explored themes of identity, memory, and the trauma of war. Women gained the right to vote and increasingly participated in public life. The image of the new woman, independent, fashionable, and assertive, reflected broader shifts in gender roles. Yet traditional expectations remained, and the tension between past and future was ever present. By the late 1920s, the Republic appeared to be stabilizing. International relations improved, and Germany joined the League of Nations. Streets were cleaner, schools better funded, and hope slowly returned. But beneath the surface, anxieties lingered. The wounds of war and the weight of Versailles had not healed. And in 1929, as the global economy faltered, Germany's fragile recovery began to unravel. The Wall Street crash sent shockwaves across Europe. German banks collapsed, unemployment soared, and political extremism surged. The Republic, already precarious, found itself once more on unstable ground. The centre weakened, and voices from the fringes grew louder. But that, as ever, belongs to the next chapter. For now, we leave the Weimar Republic in its moment of quiet optimism, hopeful, yet haunted, free, yet fragile, a republic caught between memory and promise, standing briefly in the uncertain light of the post-war world. As the 1930s dawned, Germany found itself caught in the stillness of a deepening crisis. The Weimar Republic, born of war and burdened by debt, now struggled beneath the weight of global depression. Factories stood idle, shops closed their doors, and unemployment lines stretched through cold, grey streets. The promise of democracy, briefly bright, now flickered under the strain of hunger and disillusionment. Into this atmosphere of fear and longing stepped a movement that promised clarity, strength, and a return to greatness, offering not nuance but certainty. At its head stood Adolf Hitler. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, had been present in the political margins throughout the 1920s. It combined nationalism, racial ideology, and fervent opposition to the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler, its most compelling speaker, used rallies, radio, and simple slogans to reach a population increasingly ready to listen. His message was direct. Germany had been betrayed. Its enemies were internal as well as external, and only unity, defined narrowly and ruthlessly, could restore the nation. In January 1933, after months of political manoeuvring and under pressure from conservative elites who believed they could control him, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. What followed was a rapid dismantling of the Republic. The Reichstag fire in February provided the pretext for emergency powers. The Enabling Act, passed soon after, gave Hitler authority to legislate without parliamentary consent. Parties were banned. Trade unions were dissolved. Opposition voices were silenced by prison, exile, or death. The new regime called itself the Third Reich, positioning itself as the heir to the medieval Holy Roman Empire and the Imperial Germany of Bismarck, but its methods were brutal and its vision uncompromising. The state became totalitarian, extending its reach into every corner of life. Citizens were expected to conform, to report, to participate. Children joined the Hitler Youth. Women were urged to bear children for the fatherland. Art, literature, and education were bent to the service of ideology. Central to this vision was the idea of racial purity. Jews, long marginalized in European history, became the primary target. Anti-Semitic laws gradually excluded them from professions, public life, and citizenship. Their shops were boycotted, their rights stripped, their safety increasingly at risk. On the night of September 10th to November 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, Jewish synagogues, businesses, and homes were attacked across the country. The violence was widespread, the arrests numerous, and the message unmistakably clear. As Germany rearmed, violating the Treaty of Versailles, many Europeans hesitated to intervene. Memories of the First World War lingered, and the desire for peace often outweighed the will to confront. Hitler moved cautiously at first, remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, annexing Austria in 1938, and occupying the Sudetenland later that year. Each move was accompanied by propaganda, plebiscites, and assurances, yet each also revealed the true direction of the regime. In September 1939, after Hitler demanded territory from Poland and signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, German forces invaded. Britain and France responded by declaring war. The Second World War had begun, not with a sudden explosion, but with the grinding advance of tanks and the thunder of aircraft across Polish skies. Germany's early campaigns were swift and devastating. Poland fell in weeks. Denmark and Norway were taken in the spring of 1940. The Low Countries followed, and in June, Paris fell. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined speed, coordination, and psychological impact. It left armies disoriented and civilians reeling. Yet, as the war widened, its nature darkened. In the east, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 opened a vast and brutal front. Battles were enormous, casualties staggering, and conditions often inhuman. The war was no longer just military. It had become ideological, a campaign of annihilation. Commissars were executed, civilians targeted, and entire villages erased. Parallel to the military campaign was a program of systematic murder. The Holocaust, as it would later be known, unfolded gradually, first through exclusion, then deportation, then killing. Ghettos were established, where Jewish communities were confined in wretched conditions. Mass shootings occurred in forests and fields, carried out by mobile death squads. In 1942, the Wannsee Conference formalized what the regime called the final solution, the industrial extermination of Jews across Europe. Concentration camps became death camps. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, names now etched into memory, functioned not as prisons, but as factories of death. Men, women, and children were transported in cattle cars, stripped, sorted, and gassed. 6 million Jews were murdered, along with Romani people, political prisoners, homosexuals, disabled individuals, and others deemed unfit by the regime. At home, the war brought increasing hardship. Allied bombing campaigns targeted German cities, reducing many to rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne all suffered devastation. Rationing intensified, families were separated, and fear became constant. Yet loyalty to the regime, often fueled by fear or genuine belief, persisted. Propaganda continued. The Gestapo enforced compliance. And for many, the hope of victory, or at least survival, remained. But by 1943, the tide was turning. The defeat at Stalingrad marked a significant shift. Soviet forces began to push westward. The Western Allies landed in Italy, and then, in June 1944, on the beaches of Normandy. Germany found itself squeezed from both sides. Resistance within Germany grew, though it remained scattered and dangerous. In July 1944, an attempt to assassinate Hitler failed. Reprisals were swift and unforgiving. As the Allies advanced, evidence of the regime's crimes emerged. Camps were liberated, survivors found, records recovered. The scale and systematic nature of the Holocaust became undeniable. By April 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin. Hitler, now isolated and increasingly irrational, took his own life in a bunker beneath the city. Germany surrendered unconditionally on the 8th of May, 1945. The war had claimed the lives of over 60 million people worldwide. Germany itself lay in ruins, its cities bombed, its infrastructure shattered, its people traumatized. The Third Reich, which had promised greatness, left only ashes and mourning. In the years that followed, the world would try to make sense of what had occurred. Trials were held at Nuremberg, where leading Nazis were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. The process was imperfect, but it marked a beginning, a public reckoning with guilt, complicity, and justice. For Germany, the end of the war was not simply defeat, it was rupture. The state was divided, occupied by foreign powers, and stripped of sovereignty. Yet within that rupture lay the possibility of renewal, of a different kind of future. But that future would emerge slowly, cautiously, and under watchful eyes. And so we close this chapter not with triumph, but with reflection, with the quiet understanding that history is not always measured in progress, and that beneath the banners and battles lie the lives of ordinary people, hoping, enduring, remembering. As the guns fell silent in 1945 and the smoke cleared from Europe's battlefields, Germany stood broken. Its cities were gutted, its government dissolved, its people disoriented. What had once been a powerful state now lay beneath the boots of occupying forces, divided among the Allied victors, each with their own vision for what Germany should become. The future was not shaped by the Germans themselves, but by the quiet negotiations and practical arrangements of others. And so, from the rubble of the Third Reich, a divided nation emerged, East and West Germany, separate in system, purpose, and path. The initial post-war plan had been for unity, Germany as a single demilitarized state, administered jointly by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The country was divided into 4 occupation zones, as was the capital, Berlin. Yet as the wartime alliance gave way to the Cold War, ideological differences deepened. The Western Allies favored a democratic, market-based Germany. The Soviet Union envisioned a socialist state within its sphere of influence. By 1949, these differences had hardened into separation. In May, the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, or West Germany, was proclaimed in the Western zones, with Bonn as its capital. It adopted a democratic constitution and was led by Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, a Catholic conservative with a firm belief in integration with Western Europe. In October, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, was established in the Soviet zone, its capital in East Berlin. It became a socialist state, governed by the Socialist Unity Party and aligned closely with Moscow. In the West, reconstruction began swiftly. The Marshall Plan, a program of American aid, provided funds and materials to rebuild industry, infrastructure, and housing. The currency reform of 1948 introduced the Deutsche Mark, stabilizing the economy and laying the groundwork for recovery. The Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, followed, rapid growth fueled by exports, investment, and labor. Cities were rebuilt, factories reopened, and consumer goods returned to shop windows. Life in West Germany became increasingly prosperous. Television sets, washing machines, and cars became common. Children returned to school, and the university system resumed its place at the heart of intellectual life. Former Nazis were quietly reintegrated into society, though not without controversy. War crimes trials continued for a time, but attention gradually turned to the future rather than the past. Adenauer pursued a policy of Westbindung, binding West Germany to the Western Bloc. The country joined NATO in 1955, integrated into the European Economic Community, and rebuilt ties with France, Italy, and others. It did not, however, recognize the East German state, maintaining instead the principle of eventual reunification. East Germany followed a very different course. Under Soviet guidance, the GDR became a centrally planned economy, with collectivized agriculture, nationalized industry, and a strong emphasis on ideological conformity. The ruling Socialist Unity Party, SED, maintained control through a network of surveillance, censorship, and state institutions. The Ministry for State Security, or Stasi, became infamous for its thoroughness, monitoring conversations, opening letters, and recruiting informants in every corner of society. Yet, despite the repression, the GDR also saw progress. Housing blocks rose on the ruins of bombed cities. Healthcare and education were widely accessible. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, supported by state childcare. Culture was promoted, though tightly controlled, and a distinct East German identity began to emerge. But the economy lagged behind the West, and personal freedoms remained limited. Berlin became the symbolic heart of the divide. Though located entirely within East Germany, the city itself remained divided into 4 sectors. In 1948-49, the Soviets attempted to cut off West Berlin through a blockade, only to be met with the Berlin Airlift, an extraordinary logistical effort by the Western Allies to supply the city by air for nearly a year. The most visible marker of division came in 1961, with the construction of the Berlin Wall. East Germany, facing a steady exodus of skilled workers and professionals to the west, erected the wall to stop the flow. It was not a line of defense, but of containment. Families were divided overnight. Streets were cut in half. Watchtowers and guards ensured that escape attempts, often desperate and daring, were met with arrest or death. The wall became both a physical and symbolic barrier between systems, ideologies, and lives. For the next 3 decades, the two Germanys coexisted uneasily. West Germany prospered, its political system maturing into a stable parliamentary democracy. Leaders like Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt guided it through economic shifts, social changes, and global tensions. Brandt's Ostpolitik sought to normalize relations with the East, recognizing its existence while maintaining hope for future unity. East Germany, meanwhile, endured. Its citizens learned to navigate the constraints of daily life, adapting, compromising, sometimes resisting. There were moments of pride, successes in sport, culture, and science, but also quiet disappointment. Travel was restricted, goods were limited, and the gap between promise and reality grew wider with each passing year. Yet beneath the structures of the state, human life persisted. Birthdays were celebrated, gardens tended, music played. Letters crossed the divide, sometimes censored, often treasured. Families met at checkpoints. Children in East Berlin heard the distant hum of Western television and imagined lives they could not live. In the West, some looked eastward, not with hostility, but with curiosity, nostalgia, or quiet sadness. The Cold War continued, sometimes warming, often cooling, with Germany always at its heart. The 1970s and 1980s brought new tensions over arms, ideology, and influence. Yet the idea of reunification, though increasingly abstract, never fully faded. It remained in textbooks, speeches, and the quiet hope of those who remembered a different map. And then, in the late 1980s, change came swiftly. The Soviet Union began to reform under Mikhail Gorbachev. Protests grew in Eastern Europe. In Leipzig and other East German cities, peaceful demonstrations gathered momentum. Wir sind das Volk, we are the people, became the chant. The regime wavered, borders loosened, and on the 9th of November, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, not with an explosion, but with confusion, celebration, and the quiet collapse of a barrier long thought permanent. East and West Germans met with tears, embraces, and astonishment. Borders dissolved, identities shifted, and within a year, on the 3rd of October 1990, Germany was reunified, not by decree, but by decision, negotiated and enacted by leaders and citizens alike. And so, after 4 decades of division, Germany once more became one. But it was not a return to the past. It was a new beginning, shaped by memory, complexity, and the enduring effort to live together. Not as mirror images, but as neighbours. Finally, again, part of the same home. The reunification of Germany in 1990 was not marked by triumphalism, but by quiet astonishment. By the slow realization that something once thought permanent had gently come undone. The wall, so long a symbol of division, had crumbled with unexpected ease, and 2 German states, once separated by history and ideology, were becoming one. Yet reunification was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a new and more intricate chapter, one shaped not only by hopes fulfilled, but also by the patient, often difficult work of integration. On 3 October 1990, the German Democratic Republic formally ceased to exist. Its territory became part of the Federal Republic of Germany, and Berlin was restored as the nation's capital. The moment was both historic and human. Streets filled with celebration, flags waved from windows, and tears were shed across generations. But alongside the joy came uncertainty. Two systems, economic, political, and social, were merging, and the path forward was neither simple nor smooth. Economically, the challenges were immense. East Germany's industries, long insulated from market forces, were inefficient and outdated. The Treuhandanstalt, a government agency tasked with privatizing state-owned enterprises, moved swiftly, but the results were uneven. Many factories closed, unemployment soared, and whole communities faced decline. Towns that had once thrived under planned economies now struggled to adapt to competition and change. For individuals, the transition was deeply personal. Workers retrained, pensions were recalculated, and careers were abruptly altered. Some felt liberated, others disoriented. A generation raised under socialism now navigated capitalism, while younger people moved westward in search of opportunity. The sense of equality, however limited, that had defined GDR life was replaced by the uncertainties of the market. And though the Deutsche Mark brought stability, it also revealed disparities between incomes, services, and expectations. Politically, reunification required careful negotiation. New administrative structures were created, laws harmonized, and elections held. Former East German politicians entered the Bundestag, and former dissidents took on new roles in civic life. The Stasi archives were opened, allowing citizens to read their own surveillance files, revealing betrayals, misunderstandings, and the vast machinery of control. This reckoning with the past was difficult, but necessary. It helped to foster transparency, even as it reopened old wounds. Culturally, the merging of identities was slow and uneven. The term Ostalgie, a nostalgic affection for aspects of East German life, emerged, reflecting both pride and loss. Films, literature, and art began to explore the experiences of life in the GDR, not to glorify it, but to preserve its memory with nuance. Meanwhile, in the West, many were forced to confront their own assumptions and to understand that reunification was not a victory lap, but a shared responsibility. Over time, investments flowed into eastern regions. Infrastructure improved, cities were renovated, and cultural life revived. Leipzig, Dresden, and Weimar regained their old charm, blending history with renewal. Education, healthcare, and public services became more evenly distributed, and while economic disparities persisted, especially in rural areas, the gap slowly narrowed. In the decades that followed, Germany found itself facing new challenges. As a reunited country, it played a growing role in European affairs. It became a leading member of the European Union, a voice for stability during the Eurozone crisis, and a haven for refugees in 2015. Its political landscape evolved, with new parties emerging, and debates over identity, memory, and belonging continued. The legacy of the past remained ever present. Memorials to the Holocaust, the World Wars, and the Berlin Wall dotted the landscape, not as marks of shame, but as reminders of responsibility. Germany's commitment to Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, became a model for others. Schools taught history with honesty, museums explored complexity, and public discourse remained grounded in reflection rather than erasure. Generational change brought new perspectives. For many born after reunification, the division of Germany is a memory they do not carry personally. They live in a country that is pluralistic, digital, and deeply interconnected with the world, yet they also inherit the lessons of history lessons not only of warning but of resilience. Berlin, once divided, became a symbol of unity. Its boulevards blend east and west, its buildings mix styles and eras. The city pulses with creativity, diversity, and a kind of modest pride. Here, one can walk from the Brandenburg Gate to Alexanderplatz, past reminders of division and markers of renewal, feeling the quiet echo of time in each step. Elsewhere, in smaller towns and countryside villages, life is slower but no less meaningful. Church bells still ring, trains arrive with regularity, and conversations unfold in dialects shaped by region and memory. The past is not forgotten but woven into the daily fabric, acknowledged, respected, and carried forward. Germany today is not without its challenges. Political polarization, migration, climate change, and the pressures of globalization test the social fabric. But it remains a country committed to dialogue, to democracy, and to learning. Its strength lies not in perfection, but in perseverance, in the quiet willingness to face complexity with care. And so, the history of Germany, long marked by division and upheaval, has in its most recent chapters become a story of integration, reflection, and quiet continuity. It is a history still unfolding, slowly, patiently, and with a deep awareness of where it has come from. And as we reach the end of this journey, let us rest here for a moment in the gentle cadence of a reunited land, where the past lingers, not as shadow, but as guide, and the present moves gently forward, step by thoughtful step. That brings us gently to the end of the history of Germany, a journey across centuries, softly told and slowly paced, from tribal hearths to modern streets, from forest paths to parliamentary halls. If you've listened this far, perhaps you've found, as intended, a quiet rhythm to drift into, a sense of time unhurried and stories unfolding like pages beneath a sleeping hand. Should you wish to travel further, through the cobbled lanes of a medieval market, the candlelit silence of a monastic cell, or the long train rides of the 19th century, just let me know the next title and we'll begin again, gently, together. Sleep well, and thank you for listening.